Finally, enlightenment in its view of the action of faith finds the rejection of enjoyment and possessions wrong and purposeless. As to the rejection being wrong, enlightenment is in agreement with faith on this point. For faith itself acknowledges this reality of possessing, holding on to, and enjoying property. In holding on to property, its behavior is all the more self-centered and stubborn. And in its enjoyment, it is all the more crudely self-abandoned, since its religious act of giving up possessions and enjoyment falls on the far side of this reality and purchases freedom for itself on that side. This service of sacrifice of natural impulses and enjoyments has, in fact, owing to this antithesis, no truth. Retention occurs along with sacrifice. The latter is merely a symbol which performs real sacrifice on only a small portion, and is therefore, in point of fact, only a sacrifice in imagination. In paragraph 569, Hegel now turns to the Enlightenment's take on the action or the working, the deed of faith, what it is that the consciousness, or you might say also the community and institution of those who are representing and are motivated by faith, what it is that they're doing. And the Enlightenment makes this critique at many points. If you want to look for works in which this sort of thing is taking place in early modernity, and indeed in the 18th century, which is just before Hegel, the century of the Enlightenment, also called the siècle de lumière, right? Then you could say look at Hume and his natural history of religion and the many discussions of religion, or look at the encyclopedists, or look at so many other authors. Now, what is being criticized here is faith's action. We've already looked at how it comports itself, you might say, cognitively or intellectually. Now we're looking at how it does things practically, but also, we could say, performatively. And Hegel tells us enlightenment is rejecting the rejection that faith is proposing. And it's saying this rejection, this sacrifice, this valuation that you're engaging in. Hegel's not using the word asceticism here, but we might think well ahead to other people who talk about asceticism. It's really without value. It doesn't have the meaning that you're ascribing to it, oh, religious people. So he says, enlightenment in its view of the action of faith finds the rejection of enjoyment and possessions wrong and purposeless. So it's rejecting it on two grounds. The purposiveness of it we're going to see discussed in the next paragraph. But why is it wrong? Well, we can think of various forms of wrongness. Wrongness is sometimes based in an inadequate or false or selective view on things. Sometimes it's about what is morally wrong. Oftentimes these two coincide with each other. Sometimes it's because of what we might call hypocrisy, which is what the Enlightenment is actually accusing faith of at this point. So he says, as to the rejection being wrong, enlightenment is in agreement with faith on this point. So once again, we see that enlightenment, according to Hegel, and I think this is actually quite true, it doesn't work on its own account simply by erecting an entire counter-narrative and an entire systematic way of looking at things. In large respect, it uses the arms of faith against it. It uses the sincerity that's involved in religious belief against the religious believer, and thereby develops something new. So he says, enlightenment is in agreement with faith on this point. What is it in agreement about? Faith itself acknowledges this reality of possessing, holding on to, and enjoying property. Now, why is faith acknowledging that. Well, that's an interesting thing to think about. Let's put it to you this way. If it's very easy for you to give up something, is that really much of a sacrifice for you? Or are you just doing what comes naturally to you? I mean, there are people, for example, who don't like the taste of alcoholic drinks, don't like the effect of them upon them, and, it's not very difficult for them to abstain from drinking, is it? Another great example, when I was in my graduate school days, I did smoke pot a few times, and found that, I actually preferred drinking. And the main reason I did is because I couldn't stand most of the people who were smoking pot much of the time. And I said, this is not for me. Now, is that a big sacrifice to give that up? Or are we just following our natural preferences? If we're not mortifying ourselves, if we're not engaging in some sort of saying no, some sort of rejection to something that we actually want, we're not really making a sacrifice. And so the religious believer, and you think about it this way. Hegel here is talking about enjoyment and possessions. Enjoyment of what? We can talk in terms of bodily pleasures, eating, drinking. Religious people fast. They refrain from certain sexual practices, including, a wider range of partners. So there's that element of it. That's all mortification, but it's only mortification if you actually do, in fact, want to eat a bit more, or if you do have a libido that's functioning. If it's deadened, then it's not much of a sacrifice for you at all. Likewise, possessions, right? Property. Do you tithe? Do you pay a tax? Do you give up something to charity? Do you spend alms to the poor? If you don't give until it hurts, then you're not really giving in a way that matters for faith, you could say. So he goes on and he says, faith acknowledges this reality, right? In holding on to property, he says, its behavior is all the more self-centered and stubborn, and its enjoyment is all the more crudely self-abandoned. Since its religious act of giving up possessions and enjoyment, right, this canceling them out, falls on the far side of this reality and purchases freedom for itself on this side. So we have two options here. You can give these things up, and then you purchase a kind of freedom for yourself. Now, what the nature of that freedom is, that's something that we have to actually unpack. Different religious traditions, and even within different religious traditions, different people construe that in varying ways. But we also do see religious people who don't give this stuff up, who say, I'll fast, but then afterwards I'm going to stuff my face. And we can come up with all sorts of other things. Property and possessions was a big one for the religious orders of Hegel's time, many of which were quite rich. And we see this dynamic playing itself out not only in Christianity, but throughout the world religions. Oftentimes, the religious institutions can be quite secular in many respects. We might say this in our own time in terms of prestige or social media following or things along those lines. Those who are ascetic are sometimes not as ascetic as they seem to be. So let's talk now about the freedom on the other side, right? He says this freedom comes through giving up possessions and enjoyment, and it falls on the far side of reality. And he says this service of sacrifice of natural impulses and enjoyments has, in fact, owing to this antithesis, this opposition, no truth. Retention occurs along with sacrifice. The latter is merely a symbol. What's being canceled out is merely a symbol which performs real sacrifice only on a small portion. So, if you think about offerings, many religious people do not engage in tithing 10% of their income, right? which was sort of a standard back in the day, at least within Christianity. And it's interesting because, within religious institutions, there's often the kind of, let's call it, repurposing and reframing that allows monies to be diverted or properties to be diverted from one thing to the other. Now, that's not to say that this is, the norm, but this is a problem within organizations and among some ascetics. It can become a problem for the ordinary common person engaging in religious devotions as well. It's often the case that rules arise in terms of, subordinating property or the body, the externals to the internal. And then people spend all this time and ingenuity figuring out how to undermine those rules. You're not allowed to use electricity for this or that. Well, maybe batteries are okay. You're not allowed to connect to this sort of thing. You're not allowed to own this. Well, we'll find ways around that. That's a problem, and Enlightenment rightly points that out. If that happens, then he says, the latter, the sacrifice, is merely a symbol which only performs sacrifice on a small portion, and therefore, in point of fact, Hegel concludes, is only a sacrifice in imagination. Now, here he was talking about the wrongness of what it is that the action of faith is doing. Now we need to look at the purposiveness. As regards purposiveness, Enlightenment finds it inept to throw away one possession in order to know and prove that one is liberated from all possessions, to deny oneself one enjoyment in order to know and prove that one is liberated from all enjoyment. Faith itself apprehends the absolute action as a universal action. Not only is the action of its absolute being as its object a universal action for faith, but the individual consciousness, too, has to show that it is liberated entirely and generally from its sensual nature. But throwing away a single possession or renouncing a single enjoyment is not this universal action. And since in the action the purpose, which is a universal purpose, and the performance, which is a single performance, would be bound to present themselves to consciousness as essentially incompatible, that action shows itself to be one in which consciousness has no part, and thus this kind of action is seen to be really too naive to be an action at all. It is too naive to fast in order to prove that one is liberated from the pleasures of the table. Too naive to rid the body of another pleasure, as Origen did, in order to show that pleasure is finished and done with. The action itself proves to be an external and single operation, but desire is rooted inwardly and is a universal. Its pleasure disappears neither with the instrument nor by abstention from particular pleasures. In paragraph 570, Hegel is now discussing the purposiveness, that's how we're translating it, or Zweckmäßigkeit in German, of the action of the consciousness of faith, the believer, the religious institution. Here the emphasis is placed much more on the individual, of course. One thing that we want to clarify, and I've brought this up at many points in the past, is when we see this word Zweckmäßigkeit translated as purposiveness, sometimes that is a great translation, at other times it's leaving a little bit out. And I think this is one of those cases because, if we look at the lexical level of this term, right? The words that it's composed of, Zweck, goal, end, purpose, works, and that's why we've got purposiveness, and then Mäßigkeit implies that there is some sort of measure or, if you like, proportionality going on. So when we talk about something being zweckmäßig, another way to translate that would be that it is measured or proportioned to the goal, to the end, to the purpose that you've got in mind. And I think that kind of is implicit in purposiveness. If you've got some sort of idea about what it is that you want to accomplish, you do think about the means by which you would carry that out. But this goes a little bit further, I would say. And here the criticism turns explicitly on that. So what is it that's going on? Let's look at it from the attitude of what faith is doing first. He says, enlightenment thinks that it's inept to throw away one possession in order to know and prove that one is liberated from all possessions. It's silly to do this in a symbolic way, you could say, to deny oneself one enjoyment in order to know and prove that one is liberated from all enjoyment. Why would you do that sort of thing? And you could say, well, the Enlightenment, attitude only understands this sensuous world that we see in front of ourselves, in which case it doesn't make sense to throw away our enjoyment. Why should we sacrifice one good time now for our, eternal beatitude or something like that when nobody knows what the hell that means? Well, the person of faith does think that they know what that means. They do believe that, like Hegel says, that their action is a universal action and that they are doing something that is purposive in renouncing or sacrificing. So he says, faith itself apprehends the absolute action as universal action. How is it universal? By doing something on one thing, which you can perceive, in this case, renunciation, you are doing something in terms of all things. So giving up meat, for particular days of renunciation, or fasting altogether, or fasting from one point in the day to another point in the day, or fasting after you've had your meal, your one meal of the day, and then fasting from noon onward. All these are seen as having a universal significance. And what Hegel is pointing out here is a problem with this. He says, not only is the action of its absolute being as its object a universal action for faith, but the individual consciousness, too, has to show it is liberated entirely and generally from its sensual nature. So it's in a certain way participating in the absolute, right? And the absolute is engaging in this action. The absolute may have actually given examples of how to do this. You think about Christ as a figure who's providing an example and teaching explicitly in Christianity. Think about the Buddha. Think about other figures as well, right? So he says, throwing away a single possession or renouncing a single enjoyment, that's not this universal action. It is and it isn't, right? It's symbolic of this universal action, but it isn't really the universal action. Now, Hegel is going to point something out here that's quite interesting, and he's going to give you some examples here. So let's go through this. He says, in the action, the purpose, which is universal purpose, and the performance, which is a single performance, would be bound to present themselves to consciousness as essentially incompatible. The action shows itself to be one in which consciousness has no part, and thus this kind of action is really too naive to be an action at all. It can't be purposive, it can't be tailored to the end in sight by the very fact of its individuality, its finiteness, its restrictedness. And so he gives some examples here. It's naive to fast in order to prove that one is liberated from the pleasures of the table. I'm reminded, for example, of St. Anselm's discussion of fasting in the De Similitudinibus, which is not translated at this point from Latin. And it's directed to monks. Monks did a lot of fasting, right? And Anselm says, it's better off for you, and this is roughly paraphrasing, if you become a jerk when you fast, don't fast. Instead, work on your terrible temper or your uncharitableness. God will like that more than you just giving up some food and then yelling at your fellow brethren. Keep it in perspective. Make it zweckmäßig, right? Anselm might be saying, although he's writing in Latin rather than German. Anselm would frame this in terms of prudence, which is another way of understanding purposiveness in this sense. Hegel also brings up the example of Origen. And he says, you got to read between the lines here. Too naive to rid the body of another pleasure as Origen did in order to show that pleasure is finished and done with. What did Origen do? He castrated himself, which was seen as a bad thing by his fellow Christian theologians and brethren. People were like, that is not the example to follow, right? Mutilating yourself, no, that's not a good idea. But Origen thought, well, if it can rid me of these problems. And, you might think about contemporary examples where people are struggling with something that they feel stands in the way of their proper relationship with the divine, and they deliberately try to cut or burn that out of their life. Now, why is this going to fail? Hegel here brings us back to a fundamental issue. Consciousness, especially self-consciousness, is desire. You cannot eliminate desire entirely from the picture, or else you eliminate consciousness as well. And neither can you even eliminate the pleasures entirely, even if you castrate yourself, or starve yourself, or don't listen to music, or only wear drab clothing, or pick whatever else it is. Give up your engagement to your fiancé in order to become a religious writer, as somebody quite influenced by and also opposed to Hegel will do several decades later. So he says the action proves to be an external and single operation, right? The sacrifice. But desire is rooted inwardly and is a universal. Its pleasure disappears neither with the instrument nor by abstention from particular pleasures. Hegel is saying that we have particular pleasures, which we can give up, but we can't give up pleasure altogether. Isn't that an extraordinary thing to say? Nor can we give up the desire for it altogether either. But enlightenment on its side here isolates the inward, the unreal, as opposed to reality, just as it held fast to the externality of the thing, as opposed to the inwardness of faith in the latter's contemplation and devotion. It places the essential factor in the intention, in the thought, and thereby saves itself the trouble of actually accomplishing the liberation from natural aims. On the contrary, this inwardness is itself the formal element which has its filling in the natural impulses, which are justified simply by the fact that they are inward, that they belong to universal being, to nature. Here in this short paragraph number 571, Hegel now turns his gaze onto the Enlightenment and starts out pointing some of the problems in the Enlightenment's own perspective, both on faith and on itself. Remember that this entire section, which we're coming to the end of, was the struggle of enlightenment with superstition, which is what it construed faith as being. And this really means a struggle of enlightenment not only with faith as its, you might say, twin, but also with itself, because there's a sort of superstition that can come to inhabit enlightenment as well, of which it has to purify itself. So Hegel says, enlightenment on its side isolates the inward, the unreal, the Unwirkliche, as opposed to reality, the Wirklichkeit, right? We've seen this opposition coming up many times through the phenomenology. The ideal, the inward, the intentional, as opposed to how things actually are out there in the world that has to be in some way transformed. And in many times we see a productive interchange between these. Here there's a split that's going on. He says, just as it held fast to the externality of the thing as opposed to the inwardness of faith in the latter's contemplation and devotion. So enlightenment, he says, places the essential factor in the intention, the Ansicht, right? In the thought, thereby saves itself the trouble of actually accomplishing the liberation from natural aims. Now, why would enlightenment have to engage in such a liberation from natural aims, natural purposes, natural desires? Well, it's been criticizing faith for getting that wrong, but it also does take its impetus from faith. I mean, after all, we don't want to say every single desire that we have is automatically good as desire, do we? I mean, we can go all the way back to Plato, pointing out that desires and pleasures, there was a long-standing sort of argument being made that Plato is responding to in a number of dialogues, where he says, you're saying that any desire or any pleasure is automatically good? Well, why do we say some of them are bad then? Are we just mistaken? Are we off base in saying that some of them are honorable or dishonorable? Now, some people did bite the bullet in that case, or you might say seize one of the horns of a dilemma and say, yes, as a matter of fact, any pleasure whatsoever is good. Just sometimes people think they're disgraceful, and you can derive a certain amount of pain from that. But if they weren't, bothering you, you wouldn't have a bad conscience, and you'd feel great doing whatever it is that you want. We can think this out a little bit further, and this is what they in fact did in the Enlightenment, and try to figure out how we can coordinate our aims and desires and pleasures that we take so that we're not interfering with others. But that implies that not all desires are to be indulged. And in fact, some of them are bad. By the way, one of the people who presents this problem in its starkest form, which is why he received so much discussion by people examining the Enlightenment, was the Marquis de Sade. Now, Hegel's not talking about that here, but that gives you a little bit of useful backdrop, I think. So it's important that enlightenment actually does accomplish the liberation from natural aims, even if it's to return to natural aims. There has to be a certain kind of selectivity. So Hegel says, on the contrary, this inwardness, the inwardness for enlightenment now, is itself the formal element which has its filling in the natural impulses, which are justified simply by the fact that they're inward, that they belong to universal being, that is, to nature. This is not a resolution to the problem. This is a posing of the problem. And enlightenment at this point should be realizing that it's got more now that it actually has to sort out.